Let's bring in Ambassador Dennis Ross, former Special Middle East Coordinator, Fox News Foreign Affairs Analyst, and author of Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli Relationship from Truman to Obama. Ambassador, I mean, the hatred is just incomprehensible. And as we heard from Connor just now, can you describe the depth of opposition by the jihadis and the radicals against the more moderate Sufis?
The jihadis, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, basically reject the idea of the other, and they especially reject the idea of the other when there are Sunni Muslims who seem to embrace it. Sufi Islam is really a more mystical form of Islam. It has shrines to saints, which is a little different than is the norm. They're viewed as kind of intermediaries with the Prophet. And from the standpoint of the radical Islamists, they take this as being a form of rejection of Islam. And it becomes, in a sense, an excuse for them to go after what I call the other. The problem with the radical Islamists is that basically they treat anyone who they consider to be the other as fair game to kill. What makes them so unacceptable is that basically their whole ideology is an ideology of power and control, but exclusion and intolerance, and basically one frequently of murder.
And the other, as you so point out, could be infidels, certainly Christians, the Coptic Christians who've seen the attacks on Christian churches, and also, so sadly, on themselves, on the fellow members of the fellow religion. This goes back centuries.
What we're seeing is that, unfortunately, ISIS and Al-Qaeda ultimately tend to make other Muslims the victims. It's not just that they will carry the attack outside of the region, but you look at all the attacks that they've carried out inside the region, and if you look at the actual number of people who've been killed, most of those who've been the victims of their violence and their assaults have been other Muslims.
So then where is the outrage? Where are the public calls against this, from the mosque? Are they that? Are they? Or are there the elements within that religion who have been trying to defeat this? We saw what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Basically, right. That's kind of like a revolution to support moderates there.
It is, and what's interesting is we saw a couple of things. You had the early report on Palestinians coming out, but today in the Sinai, thousands of students came out to condemn what had happened and marched, something you really haven't seen before. You had a gathering today in Saudi Arabia of the coalition to counter radical extremism, and the Crown Prince there made a point of emphasizing the solidarity and the need to respond to this, but also to condemn those within, those who define themselves as radical Islamists, to condemn them and to condemn what they represent, that they don't represent the religion, they represent a perversion of the religion. It may well be that these kinds of actions can galvanize the kind of broader Middle East to begin to focus much more on discrediting radical Islamists. Islam is a religion, it's a faith. Islamism is an ideology, and the radical Islamists are pursuing that ideology of power and control and exclusion, and discrediting them. You can't just defeat them through military means. They have to be discredited. Those in the West can't discredit them. It has to come from those in the Middle East, those who are Sunni Muslims. They're the ones who can say this is a perversion of our faith, and in fact that they are enemies of our faith.
We certainly hope that the Sunnis, do that. I mean, rise up. And you mentioned the West can't do it. Let me read you one tweet, finally, from President Trump about this attack. Horrible and cowardly terrorist attack on innocent and defenseless worshippers in Egypt. The world cannot tolerate terrorism. We must defeat them militarily and, as you say, discredit the extremist ideology that forms the basis of their existence. Can they be defeated militarily? And can, Ambassador, we finally, or they finally, defeat their philosophy to stop this?
It really is two different questions. Defeating them militarily at one level can be done, but we're seeing in the Sinai itself, many of those who may have been responsible for these attacks may have left Syria and Iraq. The more we succeed militarily in Syria and Iraq, the more we may find that smaller groups of those who are fighting for ISIS there basically relocate. And some of them are relocating in the Sinai. Those who previously were part of the ISIS-related groups in the Sinai had actually been killed. They're being replaced by those who seem to be more effective in terms of carrying out terror. So this is a long struggle militarily, but it also has to have, as you just pointed out, It has to have a philosophical component. It also has to have an economic component. You can't allow a vacuum to emerge. You need reconstruction in places where there's been great destruction. There needs to be good governance. One of the sources of alienation of people throughout the Middle East has been really terrible governance. If you want to ensure that there's not fertile ground for ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the radical Islamists, you got to ensure that there is hope, a sense of possibility, and that there's an economic future. All these things come together. You need what amounts to a comprehensive strategy if we're going to defeat them. It has a military element, it has an economic element, and it also has an ideological element that must come from Sunni Muslims.
A sense of hope certainly is what is needed. Ambassador Dennis Ross, thank you. And I want to point out to our viewers, you will be heard tomorrow morning on my Fox News Rundown podcast. Just go to foxnews.com. It's the Fox News Rundown podcast. You get Ambassador Ross for like 15 minutes and more analysis. Ambassador Ross, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course.